I'm going to show you how to use houses correctly. I have not seen very many people out there who seem to understand this, and this is mostly because there's not a lot of material out there that explicitly states this, but as far as I'm aware, it is the truth. And so most people use either a quadrant house system or the whole sign system, sometimes equal houses, but that's not very many people. This is a chart divided with quadrant houses. As you can see, the degree and the midheaven are apart from each other by degrees of ascensions, and so that doesn't always land equally in the zodiac. And so the midheaven can drift back and forth, and at high latitudes it can actually drift all the way into the 12th or the 7th house. And so that can greatly affect a chart. From the Renaissance up to the modern period, the astrologers swore up and down that quadrant houses is the only way to go. You have to divide houses that way. If you look at the Greeks and the Persians, they didn't use houses that way. They used whole sign, but then they grafted on, I think at the time it's what we now call alkebusious houses. But it's a quadrant house system. And they use it to find angularity. But they don't use it to define topics. So I guess I've used this chart before as an example, but Max Verstappen is a Formula One race car driver, and as far as I know, his birth time is reasonably accurate, so I keep using his chart. As far as I know, his birth time is reasonably accurate. And so he has a Sagittarius rising in the 8th degree of the ascendant. As you can see, Mars is behind the angle. He's in the 12th quadrant house, and yet he is in the first whole sign. Now, the way you should interpret this is Mars topically has first house significations. Mars in the first is going to have certain degree of significations. It's going to import 5th house and 12th house significations into first house manifestation, I guess. However, because he's behind the angle by more than 5 degrees, you could say that it is cadent. Cadent from the angle, which basically means weak in terms of power. The chart reads a lot differently, and you can see here with Mercury and the moon, it's kind of the same thing, where it's behind the angle. That the midheaven's in Libra here, but planets in the 10th sign, Mercury and in the moon and the north node, are actually in the 10th sign from the ascendant. However, they are cadent, which means weak, and the sun, of course, would then be angular or strong dynamically. That is how you're supposed to read houses. And I've not seen there's been a lot of debate back and forth about this, but from what I've read and a lot of the texts that I've read, the truth seems to be about this. It seems to be that it's a combination of quadrant and whole sign houses. Because if you've used whole sign houses for certain things, you can definitely tell there's something to it, but purely using whole sign is excluding very important information. If you just used whole signs, you would never know the degree of these angles. And these angles are important in a chart, because when you get transits that pass them, it will activate things. You know, when you do things like, let's see, I'll go up here and animate the bi-wheel, and I will do perfections. So I'll do perfections for him, and you'll see that, the midheaven is up in here, and the ascendant's being perfected through Aries at this point in time that this video was made. But if you don't know the degrees of these angles, then things like perfections are kind of just, well, I wouldn't say they're useless, but they're definitely a lot less accurate. You're going to be off by several months or even a year, up to a year. And so it's just prudent to take into account the information that you have at hand. And if that information is angles of the chart, because a lot of people are going to have, Sagittarius rising, which would be the 10th sign and be Virgo, but not everyone's going to have planets in this configuration with the midheaven at this point. There's a lot more subtlety going on. And you can read all that by essentially looking at both house systems together and using that strategy. And you got to ask yourself, does Max Verstappen have Mars in the 12th house qualities, or does he have Mars in the first qualities? I'd be willing to venture a guess that Mars in the first seems to make a lot more sense. And even if you look at the Michel Gauquelin data, the French astrologer who did a lot of statistical analysis, so he looked at a bunch of athletes and celebrities and figured out if Mars was prominent there, and it was. So at this point, the Gauquelin data would suggest that Mars here would be dynamic. He would be in the first. And of course, behind the midheaven, that distance is even greater. And you would think that the ninth quadrant house wouldn't have anything to do with the 10th, but it does. And so that again further supports, the veracity of whole sign houses, but also the nature of quadrant houses as well. So again, it really is both together. It's not just one or the other. I think for a beginner, it can get a little bit confusing, but for any remotely seasoned astrologer, it is just so much better. So much better. I hope this helps.